Train wreck's only survivor, crushed and forgotten. A Lakota chief found her and gave her a name. The iron was still hot when I reached her. Not the rails. The rails had been cold since before dawn, twisted up out of the earth like something that had been sleeping wrong for 1,000 years and finally gave up trying. The iron I mean was the door brace, a thick crossbar from the baggage car, half buried in the snow beside her. I pulled it free without thinking about it because it was in my way, and even through my elk-hide gloves I could feel the warmth still in it, like it had just let go of something alive. She was underneath it, mostly underneath. Her right shoulder and the side of her face were pressed into the white, and her hair, brown going to gold at the ends, matted with ice and something darker, was fanned out behind her like she'd been dropped from a height. I knelt. She was breathing, barely. You could see it only because the cold made each breath a small cloud, and those clouds were coming slow, one after another, like the intervals between them kept growing. My second, a man named Charging Elk who had ridden out with me from the camp that morning, said her name when he crouched beside me. Except he didn't say a name. He said, "What do we call her?" I said nothing then. I was looking at her hands. They were still clutched to her chest around something, a small leather satchel, the strap broken, the flap forced shut by the grip of her fingers. Whatever was in it, she'd held it even when everything else in that train was being shaken loose and scattered across 300 yards of South Dakota prairie. That told me something. It didn't tell me her name, but it told me something. I stood and looked back up the ridge. The train had come off the bridge, the trestle over Elk Creek, which the crews had been saying for 2 winters needed replacing, which the company in Chicago had been saying for 2 winters was fine. The bridge hadn't been fine. The forward cars had gone down into the creek bed, which was frozen but not frozen thick enough for 6 cars of iron and timber to land on. The rear cars had jumped the grade and scattered across the hillside. 12 cars total, from what I could count. We'd been hearing the echoes of the crash from 12 miles out at first light and ridden toward it expecting to find survivors. Survivors plural. She was all we found. I'm not going to say I understood it. I don't still. Whether everyone else had already been pulled out by the time we arrived, taken to Rapid City or Pier by someone who came from the other direction, a possibility, or whether the prairie had simply decided that this one woman was the only life it meant to spare, I can't say. What I can tell you is that we searched for 4 hours, Charging Elk and my nephew Red Leaf and 2 others from the camp. We walked every car we could get into, and the ones we couldn't get into we pried open. We turned over what could be turned. We shouted into the timber and down into the creek bed until our voices went thin. There was no one, there was her. We wrapped her in my blanket, the thick one, wool, a Hudson's Bay that my father had traded for before I was born, and Charging Elk and Red Leaf made a frame litter from 2 spruce poles and what was left of a canvas mail sack. We set her on it as gently as 4 men can manage when they are working in snow and cold, and none of them have slept. She didn't wake. She made a sound once when we moved her arm to wrap her more securely. Not a word, just a sound from somewhere deep, like something that hadn't decided yet whether to stay or go. Charging Elk looked at me over her. I said, "She comes with us." He didn't argue. None of them did. They knew me well enough by then to know that when I spoke in that particular tone, the conversation was already finished. It was 11 miles back to the winter camp. We walked it in just over 3 hours, trading off the poles when our arms tired. The snow had started again by the time we came down into the valley, light, steady, the kind that would go all day. The camp was settled in a bend of the creek, 40-some lodges, the horses in the rope corral to the east, smoke already rising from the cook fires. My daughter Running Deer saw us from a distance and came out to meet us. She was 17 that year, already taller than her mother had been, with her mother's eyes. She looked at the woman on the litter and then up at me and didn't ask anything. She just turned and walked ahead of us to my lodge to get it ready. That was a good daughter. We set the woman down inside, near the fire but not too near. Charging Elk's wife, a quiet and capable woman named Bright Morning, had some knowledge of medicine and injuries. She came without being asked. News travels fast in a camp of 40 lodges, and she knelt beside the woman and began her examination with the same unhurried certainty she brought to everything. I stood outside the lodge and let her work. The cold had sharp edges that afternoon. I stood in it and thought about the iron door brace lying in the snow beside a woman's body, still warm from the wreck that had put her there. I thought about her hands on that satchel. I thought about what Charging Elk had said. What do we call her? It was a reasonable question. You can't care for a thing that has no name. It's not a superstition, it's just the truth of how we are made. Names are how we hold on to people. Names are how we tell the world. This one matters, this one is known, this one is not lost. She had a name somewhere. She had a life somewhere. A place she'd boarded that train from, a place she'd been going to, people who were either looking for her already or would be soon. I understood all of that. But in this valley, in this camp, in the lodge where Bright Morning was working to keep her breathing, she needed a name she could be called by until she was well enough to give us her own. I went back inside. Bright Morning had cut away the left sleeve of the woman's dress and was working on a deep gash along the forearm, clean on one edge, ragged on the other, the kind a piece of flying iron makes. The woman's shoulder was out of its joint. Bright Morning had already set it back. The woman had a bruised rib, maybe two, and the left side of her face was swollen badly from the temple to the jaw. But she was breathing easier now. The shallowness was going out of it. I asked Bright Morning what she thought. Bright Morning said, "She's strong. This one held on hard." I looked at those hands again. The satchel was beside her now, set carefully at her right side. Her fingers were open. She'd finally let go. I said, "We'll call her Holds Fastidon." Running Deer, who was tending the fire, looked up at me. I said, "Until she tells us otherwise." Bright Morning nodded once and went back to her work. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my robes and listened to the woman's breathing from across the lodge and thought about the bridge and the iron and the sound she'd made when we moved her arm. That sound had been in my chest ever since, not because it was terrible. It wasn't terrible. It was just a human sound, the sound of something alive, but because it reminded me of a sound I hadn't heard in a long time. My wife had made a sound like that in the winter of her dying. Not the same sound, not the same circumstances, not anything close to the same, but the same quality of it. That quality of a person who is working very hard just to stay on this side. My wife had been dead 8 years that winter. Her name was Meadow Hawk, and she had been the best person I had ever known, and I had spent the 8 years since her death running the camp and raising Running Deer and doing the work of a chief, which is mostly the work of deciding things for other people and carrying the weight of those decisions by yourself in the middle of the night. I had been good at it. I had not been particularly happy, but happiness had not seemed like the point. The point was the work, the camp, the people. I told myself this again that night. The woman Holds Fastidon for now breathed her slow breaths across the lodge, and I lay in my robes and told myself that she was a responsibility I had taken on, nothing more and nothing less. That was true. It was completely true. I believed it entirely. She slept for 3 days. Not continuously, she surfaced a few times, enough to drink a little water or thin broth when Bright Morning held the cup, enough to move her lips once or twice, but not conscious, not present, not there in any real sense. Bright Morning came twice a day, sometimes 3 times. Running Deer sat with her often, which I hadn't asked for but found myself glad of. Red Leaf, who was my nephew and 23 and not particularly known for sensitivity, came to the lodge entrance twice to ask about her, which surprised me. She was already somebody to us. That's the strange thing. Even unconscious, even without a word, she was already somebody. On the morning of the 4th day, I came back to the lodge from the early prayer and found her sitting up. Not standing, not talking, sitting up with the blanket drawn around her and her back against the willow backrest. That running deer had moved close to her place by the fire. Her eyes were open, and she was looking at the smoke hole at the top of the lodge, where the gray winter light was coming through. I stopped at the entrance. She heard me. She turned her head slowly, which cost her something. I could see that, the bruised side of her face still dark and swollen, and she looked at me. For a long moment she looked at me. Not afraid, that's what I noticed first. I had expected fear. I had expected a white woman waking in a Lakota lodge after a train wreck to show some fear, or at least some alarm, and there was none of it. What there was instead was a kind of careful attention. She was taking me in. The way you look at a thing, you need to understand. I said in English, "You're safe here." She didn't say anything, but something around her eyes changed. I said, "You were in the train wreck. You were the only one we found. We brought you to our camp. You've been here 4 days. She looked at the smoke hole again, and then back at me. She said, and her voice was rough from not being used, 4 days. I said, yes. She said, was anyone else? I said, we searched. There was no one else. The set of her jaw when I said that, I remember it. She took it straight. She didn't argue it or weep, not right then. She just held it, set her jaw and held it and looked at the fire. I came in and sat across from her, on my side of the fire, and let her have some time with what I'd told her. After a while she said, the satchel. I looked to her right. It was still there where bright morning had put it. She reached for it, and I watched her reach and saw the moment she understood about her shoulder, that particular movement, reaching across herself. That's when you feel it if the shoulder has been hurt, and she stopped and tried a different approach, reaching straight down, and got it. She held it in her lap. She didn't open it. I said, my name is Standing Rock. I lead this camp. She looked up at me. Something went across her face that I didn't quite read. She said, Standing Rock. I said, yes. She said, my name is Clara Beaumont. I said the name back to her, Clara Beaumont. She said I was going to my sister's, in Deadwood. I said we can get word to Deadwood, when the weather allows. She looked at the satchel in her hands. She said, there are papers in here. Important papers. That's why I was holding it, even when. She stopped, started again. She said, I held it the whole time. I don't remember all of it, but I remember that. I said, I know. I could see that when I found you. She looked at me then with a directness that was a little startling. The way a person looks at you when they're deciding something about you rather than just seeing you. She said, you pulled the brace off me. I said, yes. She said, I heard it. I wasn't awake exactly, but I heard the iron move. She kept looking at me. She said, thank you. She said it plainly, without the performance of gratitude. Just the plain fact of it, put between us like an object on the ground. That was something I respected immediately. I had been thanked by white people before in ways that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with their own relief. This wasn't like that. This was just, you did this, and I am grateful for it, and I am telling you so. I said, I'm glad you were there to find. It was an honest thing to say, so I said it. For the next week she healed. Bright morning came and tended her ribs and her face and her arm. Running Deer brought food and sat with her in the mornings. The weather closed in hard on the 3rd day of that week. A true plains blizzard. 3 days of wind that drove the snow horizontal and made it impossible to see the next lodge over. And so there was nothing to do but be inside and wait it out, which is something you learn out here or you don't survive. Clara Beaumont waited it out with a patience I hadn't expected. She didn't fuss. She didn't pace. She was in pain. She was hurt. She was a long way from her sister in Deadwood, and she sat in the warm lodge and watched the fire and sometimes talked to Running Deer, who was learning a few words of English that year and was very pleased with the opportunity to practice them, and sometimes read. She had 2 books in the satchel along with the papers, a Bible and a volume of poems by someone named Whitman, and sometimes just sat. On the 2nd night of the blizzard, when Running Deer had gone to sleep and Clara was sitting up late by the fire, she asked me about my wife. She said, "Your daughter has her mother's eyes. You can tell because they're not yours." I said, "You notice a great deal for someone who's been unconscious for 4 days." She said, "I've been paying attention since I woke up." I said, "Her name was Meadow Hawk. She died 8 years ago in the winter." Clara said, "I'm sorry." I said, "You get used to being sorry. After a while you just carry it." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My husband died 2 years ago. He wasn't a good man, but he was my husband, and I carried that too for a while before I could put it down. Not the grief exactly, more the—" She stopped searching for it. She said, "The weight of having been wrong about someone. That's the harder thing to put down." I looked at her across the fire. I said, "Yes, that is the harder thing." She looked at the fire. She said, "The papers in the satchel are the deed to a piece of land in the Black Hills. My husband bought it before he died. He owed money, and his family, his brothers, they want the land. They're the reason I was going to my sister. The papers are in my name, but his brothers they've been making it difficult." She said that word, difficult, with a flatness that told me it had been worse than difficult. I said, "How difficult?" She looked at me straight. She said, "Difficult enough that the train I was on might not have been an accident." The lodge was quiet. Outside the wind was a solid sound, like the world pressing in from every side. I said, "Who would know your route?" She said they knew. I was foolish about it. I told the wrong person where I was going and when. I said, "And the bridge?" She said, "I don't know. I keep going back to it and I don't know. It might have just been the bridge. Bridges fall. But I was the only person who walked away from that wreck, and I don't entirely know what to make of that." Neither did I. I put it in the back of my mind where I keep things that need more information before they can be resolved, and I said, "When the weather clears, I'll send Red Leaf to Deadwood with a message for your sister. We'll tell her you're alive and where you are." Clara looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Why?" I said, "Why what?" She said, "Why are you doing this, all of this? The 4 days, the doctoring, sending your men out." She made a gesture that took in the lodge, the fire, all of it. I said, "Because you needed it." She said, "There are people who would have left me in the snow." I said, "I know that." She said, "And you didn't." I said, "No." She kept looking at me with that particular look, the one that was deciding something about me rather than just seeing me, and then she looked back at the fire and said, "All right." That was the end of that conversation, but something had shifted. Something that had been careful and guarded had moved slightly, the way a gate moves when someone finally takes the bar off. I went to sleep feeling it. The blizzard broke on the 3rd day. The air after a plains blizzard has a quality to it, a scoured brightness, a cold so clean it almost has a taste, and the camp came alive again the way it always does after being shut in. Horses needed checking. The wood supply needed assessment. Children who had been inside for 3 days needed to run, and they did, up and down the valley in whooping packs that you could hear from inside any lodge. I sent Red Leaf to Deadwood. He was gone 4 days and came back with a letter from Clara's sister, a woman named Ida, older, sensible sounding from the letter, worried and relieved in equal measure, and with some news from town that made me sit quietly for a while after I heard it. Her husband's brothers, 2 of them, named in the letter, had been asking after her. In Deadwood, in Rapid City. They'd spoken to the railway company about who might have survived the wreck and been retrieved. They were being described in Deadwood as concerned relations trying to locate her. Ida's letter said, "Do not trust them." It said, "Come when you can, but do not let them know where you are until you are here with me and we have spoken to our lawyer." I brought the letter to Clara in the lodge. She read it and set it in her lap and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "How long until I can ride?" Bright Morning had said 2 more weeks on the shoulder, and the ribs needed at least 10 days more. I told her. She said, I'll go in 12 days. I said, I'll take you. She looked up. I said, not to the edge of Deadwood and hand you over, all the way. I'll take you to your sister's door. She said, you don't need to do that. You're the chief of this camp. You can't just leave to escort some woman. I said, I can do what I decide to do. That's one of the few advantages of the position. She looked at me with a different expression than I'd seen yet. Something that wasn't quite a smile, but was what comes just before one. She said, that's a very confident way to talk. I said, it's an accurate way to talk. She did smile then. A small one, careful, like something she hadn't done in a while and was testing to see if it still worked. It worked. Those 12 days, I won't pretend they passed slowly. They didn't. The camp had its rhythms and I had my work in it, and Clara had her healing and her books and her growing ease with the lodge and the people in it. But there was a different quality to those days than the ones before them. The days before had been a woman I had found and was responsible for. These days were a woman I was finding out. Those are different things entirely. She was curious about everything. She asked Running Deer about the designs on the lodgepoles and what they signified. She asked Bright Morning about the plants in her medicine bundle. Bright Morning didn't speak much English, but they managed, with hands and the few words they shared, and Running Deer translating what she could. She walked outside each day as her strength came back, a little farther each time, and she'd come back into the lodge and sit by the fire and tell me what she'd observed. The horses, the way the camp was arranged, the hills to the north. One day she said, you know everything that happens in this camp. I said, it's a chief's job to know. She said, but you don't do it by being in the middle of things. You watch from the edge and then you move when you need to. I said, that's correct. She said, my husband was the same way. He watched from the edges, the difference between him and you. She stopped. I said, tell me. She said, he watched for what to use. You watch for what to protect. I didn't say anything to that. Not because it wasn't something I could respond to, but because it felt like something that deserved to be set down cleanly and left alone. Like when you hear a true thing said out loud, and any addition would only diminish it. After a while I said, what are the papers really worth, Clara? She said, I beg your pardon. I said, the deed, the land. I've been thinking about those brothers and the lengths they seem willing to go to. Land in the Black Hills worth that kind of trouble, tell me about it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, there's gold on it. My husband suspected it before he died. A small seam, he thought, but possibly more. He didn't tell his family before he died. He signed it over to me first. I said, and you know this because. She said, he told me. At the end. I don't think he was a good man, but I think he was trying to do one good thing at the end, and that was put it beyond his brother's reach. I said, where does your sister's lawyer stand on all of this? She said, he's a good man. Honest. He'll help me hold it if I can get to him with the papers. I said, then we get you to Deadwood. She looked at me. She said, Standing Rock. I said, yes. She said, you understand that going to Deadwood with me, being seen with me, if those men are watching, if they see you. I said, I've been seen by worse men than they are. She said, they're not above hiring people. I said, neither am I. She went still. She said, you do that. I said, I do what the situation requires. I'm taking you to your sister. Whatever stands between here and there is a detail. She looked at me for a long time. The fire was burning low, it was late, Running Deer long asleep, and the light it gave was orange and moving. She said, very quietly, why do you make me feel like everything is going to be all right? I said, because it is. She shook her head. Not arguing, more like she was adjusting to something, recalibrating. She said, You say that like it's not even a question. I said, some things aren't questions. She looked at the fire. After a while she said, I haven't felt that in a very long time. That thing of believing that things are going to be all right. I said, I know. I could see that in you from the first day. She said, that's a strange thing to know about a person you found unconscious in the snow. I said, I've been watching from the edges a long time. You learn to see certain things. She looked at me then, and I looked back at her, and what passed between us in that moment was not said and didn't need to be. It was simply acknowledged. The way two people acknowledge something that they both already know is true, and are going to need a little more time before they say out loud. I went to sleep that night feeling lighter than I had in 8 years. We left on the 12th day, as she had said. I took 4 men with me. Red Leaf, Charging Elk, and 2 others, Broken Hand and Gray River, who were both experienced riders and not men who startled easily. Clara rode Charging Elk's second horse, a steady sorrel mare who Clara took to immediately. She sat a horse well. She'd grown up with them somewhere, I could tell, and I rode my own gray. The first day was cold and clear and without incident. We made 30 miles. The second day the weather turned gray and threatened snow but didn't deliver, and we made another 25. We camped both nights in the open, with a good fire, and Clara slept wrapped in her own blanket now plus the Hudson's Bay that I'd put under her at the wreck site, which she hadn't given back and which I hadn't asked for. On the morning of the 3rd day, coming into the hills above Deadwood, Red Leaf dropped back to ride beside me and said, Lo, 2 riders on the ridge, following our line. I'd already seen them, I said, since the creek crossing. He said, since before that, since first light maybe. I looked at Clara riding ahead of me, her back straight, her attention forward, the satchel strapped across her body. I said to Red Leaf, ride ahead to the town and find the lawyer. His name should be at the sister's house. The sister's name is Ida Beaumont. Tell him to expect us. Take Broken Hand with you. Red Leaf looked at the ridge. He said, what about them? I said, I have Charging Elk and Gray River. That's enough for 2 men on a ridge. He held my eye for a moment and then nodded and peeled off. Broken Hand followed him. I came up beside Clara. She'd already seen them. She was watching them with a steadiness that I had come to recognize as hers, not fearless exactly, but practiced. She had been living with this for a while. She said, are they? I said, probably. She said, what do we do? I said, we ride into town. We don't change our speed. We let them show themselves or we don't. She said, and if they come down off the ridge before we reach town? I said, then we deal with it before we reach town. She said, I don't want anyone hurt on my account. I said, you're not in charge of that, ride. She rode. They didn't come down off the ridge. They followed us to the edge of Deadwood and then they stopped. Maybe they had enough sense not to try something in a town. Maybe the sight of 4 Lakota men, one of them carrying himself the way I carry myself, I've been told this, I don't say it as a boast, gave them reason to reconsider. Maybe they were just watching, taking note, reporting back to whoever sent them. We rode into Deadwood at midday. The street was busy and some of those busy people stopped to stare. That happens. I've been stared at in white towns all my life. You learn to ride through it without changing your pace or your posture, which is its own kind of answer to the staring. Red Leaf was waiting outside a wooden building on the main street. There was a man with him, early 50s, clean-shaven, the particular look of a man who spends most of his time reading documents and has learned to find that satisfying, and a woman behind him on the boardwalk who saw Clara and made a sound I heard from the street. Clara made a sound back. She got down from the sorrel. I was at her left side immediately, because the shoulder was still not full strength and dismounting on the left is harder. And her sister came off the boardwalk at a run and they caught each other in the street, right there in the mud and the January cold, and held on. I looked away. Some things belong to the people they belong to. We spent that night in Deadwood. The lawyer, his name was Grant, and he had the look of a man who took his work seriously, spent 2 hours with Clara and her sister and the papers from the satchel. Red Leaf told me later, secondhand, that Grant had said the deed was clear and legal, and that he had a colleague in Rapid City who could handle anything the brothers tried. That Clara's position was solid if she stayed in Deadwood and let him work. I went to the livery with my men and saw to the horses. There are things you do after a long ride before you do anything else, and one of them is make sure the animals that carried you there are fed and warm. It was full dark by the time I came out of the livery, and Clara was standing in the street. She'd been waiting. She had her coat pulled tight, and her breath was making small clouds in the lamplight, and she was standing in front of the livery like she'd been standing there a while. I said, "You shouldn't wait in the cold." She said, "I know. I was going to go inside and then I didn't." I said, "How did it go with the lawyer?" She said, "Good, really good. He thinks I'll be all right, he thinks." She stopped, started again. She said, "I think I'll be all right." I said, "I know you will." She looked at me. She said, "There it is again." I said, "What?" She said that, the thing you do, the way you say things, and I believe them. I said, "I say them because they're true." She stepped forward 1 step. She was close enough now that I could see her face clearly in the lamplight, the bruising fading to yellow on the left side, her eyes direct and very steady. She said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "All right." She said, "When you found me in the snow, I know you don't believe this, and I don't entirely believe it myself, but I was aware of you. Not awake, but aware. I knew something had arrived, something that meant." She looked for the word. She said, "Something that meant business." She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and it landed the same way things she said plainly always landed, clean and straight, like something set down level on a flat surface. I said I meant business. She said, "I know, and I." She stopped again. She said, "I don't do things quickly. I've made decisions quickly in my life and they've cost me. I want you to know that I'm not." She looked at me. She said, "I'm going to need time, for things, for however this is, whatever this is." I said, "I know how to wait." She said, "That I believe entirely." She reached up and put her hand against my chest, flat against the elk hide. It was a simple gesture, plain and deliberate, the way she did most things, not soft, not tentative. Just, "This is where my hand is. This is where you are." I put my hand over hers. We stood like that for a moment in the lamplight with the street going on around us and the cold pressing in from every side, and I felt something that I hadn't felt in 8 years. Not the same as before. Nothing is ever the same as before, but in the same family of feeling. The feeling of someone choosing to be where they are. Of a woman with her own will and her own reasons and her own long, clear eyes deciding that this here, this person, is where she means to stand. That's the thing about a woman who has been through something. When she chooses you, she knows what she's choosing. She's not choosing an idea. She's choosing the specific man who pulled the iron off her in the snow and rode 11 miles in the cold with her on a litter and sat across the fire from her for 12 nights and said, "I'll take you to your sister's door." She's choosing that. All of it, eyes open. I've been given many things in my life. Some I earned and some I didn't. This I earned, and I knew I'd earned it, and that was its own kind of gift. I said, "Write to me from here, when you're settled, when you know what you want to do." She said, "I will." I said, "My camp moves with the season. Red Leaf will always know where we are." She said, "All right." She didn't move her hand, and I didn't move mine for another moment. Then she said, "What does it mean, holds fast to dawn?" I hadn't told her that. Hadn't told her we'd named her. I said, "It means someone who holds on when the dark is coldest, when the dawn is still a long way off and you don't know for certain it's coming." She looked at me. She said, "That's not a bad name." I said, "No, it's not." She said, "Is it mine?" I said, "If you want it." She thought about it for a moment, a real moment, not a polite pause, and then she nodded. She said, "I want it." She took her hand back then and stepped back and looked at me one more time with those clear, steady eyes, and then she turned and went inside. I stood in the street until the door closed. Then I walked back to where my men were, and I didn't say anything to any of them, and they were wise enough not to ask. In the morning, we started back. It was a good ride. The weather held, cold and clear, and we made good time. Redleaf rode alongside me for a while in the afternoon of the second day and didn't say anything, which with Redleaf means he's thinking. After a while he said, "She's not coming with us." I said, "No, not yet." He thought about that. He said, "Yet." I didn't answer, but I also didn't tell him he was wrong. The letter came 6 weeks later. Running Deer brought it to me. She'd spotted the rider from half a mile out and been at the edge of camp to meet him, which was not a coincidence, and I sat with it for a little while before I opened it. Just sat with it, turning it in my hands. The paper was heavy, good quality. My name on the outside in a handwriting I hadn't seen before but recognized anyway. The way you sometimes recognize the handwriting of someone you haven't read, and yet somehow know. The letter was 3 pages. I'm not going to say everything that was in it because some of it was hers alone and some of it was mine alone, and that's the right way for certain things to be. But I'll say this. The lawyer Grant had done his work and the brothers had backed off, and Clara was settled in Deadwood with her sister, and she was well. She was well. She said it twice, the second time in the way that means it's true and not just what you say when someone asks. And she said she was going to come in the spring, when the passes were clear. She said, "I want to see the camp in the season when things are growing. I want to see it as itself, not buried under snow and blizzard. I want to see where you actually live." She said, "I'll bring my own horse if I can find a good one." She said, "I'm not very good at waiting as it turns out. I thought I was, I'm not." I read that last part twice. Running Deer was watching me from across the lodge, very casually, the way 17-year-olds watch things they're deeply interested in while pretending not to. I said, "She's coming in the spring." Running Deer said, "I know, I could tell from your face." I said, "What about my face?" She said, "It looks like the face of a man who got some good news." I folded the letter and put it inside my shirt. That's where I kept it. Not in a box, not on a shelf. Inside my shirt, close. An old habit, you keep important things close to you in the field, close enough that you'd know right away if they were gone. The spring came the way it always comes out here, all at once and then suddenly everywhere. The hills going green in what seems like a single day, the creek running fast and cold with the melt, the horses restless and wanting to run. Running Deer started watching the southern approach from about the middle of April, which I pretended not to notice. She came on a Tuesday, the 23rd of April, riding a blue roan mare she'd apparently found in Deadwood and was very pleased with. Redleaf saw her coming from the ridge and sent word back to camp, and by the time she rode in, everyone was doing something elaborately normal that they had carefully positioned themselves to do where they could see her arrive. I walked out to meet her. She got down from the blue roan without help. The shoulder had healed clean, she'd said so in the letter, and she stood in front of me in the spring light with the hills green behind her and her satchel across her body and her hair loose in the warm wind. She said, "I told you I wasn't good at waiting." I said, "It's only April." She said it felt like longer. I said, "Yes, it did." She looked at the camp, at the lodges and the horses, and the people who were pretending very hard not to watch. She looked at the hills and the creek and the sky, which out here in April is a blue that doesn't seem like the same color as any other blue you've seen. She said, "It's beautiful." I said, "Yes." She looked at me. She said, "You know what I decided while I was waiting?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "That a man who rides 11 miles in a blizzard carrying someone he doesn't know, and builds a fire for her and sits across from it watching over her, and then rides 2 more days to make sure her enemies don't get to her first. That man is not someone you let go back to his camp alone and only write letters to." I said, "That's what you decided." She said, "That's what I decided." I said, "I decided the same thing, more or less, in January." She shook her head like she wasn't entirely surprised, and then she stepped forward the one step that was left between us, and I put my arms around her, and she put her face against the elk hide of my coat, and we stood there in the April light while the creek ran, and the horses moved in the corral, and the whole camp of 40 lodges did its very best to look at something else. Running Deer, who I would learn later had been watching from just inside the lodge entrance, came out and took the Blue Roan's reins without being asked, and led her to the corral. Bright Morning appeared somewhere to the left and began talking about where to put Clara's things. Charging Elk said something to Red Leaf that made Red Leaf laugh. Clara pulled back far enough to look up at me. She said, "Holds fasted on." I said, "That's you." She said, "Say it in Lakota." I said it. She said it back, carefully, each sound placed like something she was going to keep. I said, "Now say it again." She said it again, better this time. I said, "Good." She said, "Good." She stayed. Not for a visit. She stayed. That's the thing I want you to understand. She hadn't come out to see and go back. She'd come out to see, and she'd seen, and what she'd seen was the man she'd already decided on from 6 weeks of letters and 4 months of carrying the weight of knowing, and she stayed. She built her life into the life of the camp, slowly and carefully, the way she did everything. She learned the language in pieces, a few words at a time, always asking when she didn't understand a thing. She learned to do the work of the camp, not because she had to. She would have been welcomed without lifting a hand, but because she was not a woman who could sit still while other people worked. Running Deer taught her things. She taught Running Deer things. Bright Morning accepted her early and fully, which was the signal the rest of the camp needed. She was good with the horses. She was good with the sick. She was stubborn as a rock in spring mud when she'd made up her mind about something, which I already knew. She did not try to change me or the camp or the way things were done. She asked questions constantly, but asking questions is different from trying to change things. Asking questions means you think something might be worth understanding. She was worth understanding. She was the most worth understanding person I had met since Meadow Hawk, and Meadow Hawk would have, I think, liked her. I think Meadow Hawk would have looked at Clara Beaumont and recognized something, the same quality maybe. The quality of a woman who does not give her trust easily, but when she gives it for good. She gave me that, Clara, all of it for good. There are things that happen to you late in a life that you didn't expect. Things that come in sideways, not from the direction you'd been watching. You think you're going out to find survivors of a train wreck. You think you're doing the work of a chief, the work of 40 lodges, the work of keeping your people through a hard winter. And you find a woman in the snow with her hands locked around a satchel that held her whole life in it, holding on so hard that even unconscious she wouldn't let go. That's not something you plan for. You just pick up the iron brace and you move it out of the way and you look at what's underneath and you decide what it requires of you. She's asleep across the lodge from me as I tell you this. The lamp is low. The camp is quiet. It's late in the season now, the first cold nights are back, the hills going brown, the horses getting thick in their coats. It's been 2.5 years since April. 2.5 years since she rode in on that Blue Roan and said she wasn't good at waiting. I'm looking at her hand. It's relaxed in her sleep, open on the robe beside her. Not clutched around anything, not holding on tight to something that might be taken. Just open. That's the thing I couldn't have known in January when I looked at those locked hands in the snow and thought, this woman knows how to hold on. I couldn't have known that the same woman, given enough reason to trust, given enough time and ground and someone who meant to stay, that same woman could learn to let go too, could sleep with her hand open and at rest. I was the reason. I'll say that plainly because it's true. She opened her hands because I gave her a place where she didn't have to hold on so hard. That's the thing I'm most proud of in my life. Not the leadership, not the decisions, not any of the 100 things a chief has to do and carry and decide in the dark alone. That. The look on her face, the first time she slept a full night without waking. The way her hand lay open in the morning. I gave her that. She gave me the rest of my life. The lamp flickers once and settles. The first snow of the season will come in a week or so. You can smell it in the cold, a particular kind of cold that has something wet and patient behind it. Running deer is over at Charging Elk's Lodge tonight, helping with their new baby who arrived 3 weeks ago. The camp is quiet. I am 54 years old. I have buried a wife and raised a daughter and led 40 lodges through winters that would kill a man who was paying less attention. I have done hard things and been a fair man, not always right, not always the same as good, but fair. And I have sat across the fire from more troubled midnights than I can count. I don't sit across from those midnights alone anymore. Her hand is open. The lamp is low. That's enough, that's everything.